Come and sit by the fire. Got a few things I'd like to talk to you about. Here. Do you know how to play chess, do you? Good. That's what I'd like to speak to you about today. Let me look here. The knight and the bishop. Now, conventional logic dictates that the bishop is the superior piece. It can move further distances, and it can also pin pieces against the king, using its own vulnerability against itself. However, the two bishops themselves seem not to be ideologically aligned. One forever being trapped to the black squares, and one to the white. Now, this uncompromising schism of thought is not shared by the knights. Oh no. A knight can protect its temporal counterpart, whilst being protected in kind. Which I think ultimately makes it the more worthy and more nobler piece. And just as in chess, so is in life. One should not judge oneself by how far we've travelled, or by what we can take, but by what we protect. If you remember nothing of this conversation, so be it. But if you remember one thing, I'd like it to be that. Right, what else do we have here? The king. Heavy is the head that wears a crown. So maybe that's why he can only move one square at a time. But in any direction. The king is the most important, and yet the weakest piece on the board. So it is. Vulnerable. But I guess being vulnerable doesn't necessarily translate to weakness, if you understand it as so. You know what makes a good king, or queen, for that matter, depending on who the primary ruler is? The ability to listen to one's advisors and courtiers. You'll never be as good as all the wise people that surround you at their own particular field. It's important to know who is good. Aye, and then listen to their advice. The king. What else do we have now here? queen. Nothing is higher than love. Nothing greater. Nothing more worthy. And nothing finer on heaven or earth. The queen is the most powerful piece on the board. And if you'd ever met your mother, you would have known why. Elegant, graceful, a fine diplomat. Just like you, in fact. The queen sweeps around the board, as many squares rank and file, or even diagonal as she chooses, like she owns the place. Aye. But now's not the time to talk about your mother, no. When we're closer to our destination, then I'll tell you more. Sure. The water, or the berserker if you wish, but can move down the rank and the file as many squares as it wants. The water is most certainly an end game piece. It can be knocked around too much by minor pieces indeed in the early game, and too trapped in as well when it first starts. But two of these things together, especially when they're linked, are more powerful than a queen. Aye. The water. And last, and unfortunately least, the pawn. Two spaces they can move forwards on their first move, one thereafter. They take on the diagonal. Now, if the pawn can move and go through the incredible hazard and gauntlet across the entire board, well, it can be promoted. In that unlikely event, it can be promoted to any piece except for the king. I guess there's a moral in that. No matter how hard you work, no matter how much effort you put in, they'll never make you a king. All men are created equal. Hardly. I'm sure one day they'll have a better system than that. But it won't be by allowing peasants to become kings. That would defeat the entire purpose. Aye. Right. Now the opening I'd like to show you today is called the King's Pawn opening. It's probably the most common of all openings, to be sure. King's Pawn moves forward 2. Now, in the opening game itself, you have 2 main objectives. The first is to control these 4 squares here, right in the middle. If you can put some control on these squares, well, then you'll be standing in good stead. And the second, that's to develop your minor pieces. So your knights and your bishops, and then eventually your queen. So what does this move do? Well, it accomplishes a few things. Firstly, you control this square, and you attack this square and this square. But also, it allows you to develop both your bishop and your queen. Under this scenario, typically, your opponent will respond in kind. Now, you don't want to continuously do exactly what your opponent does now. If he was to bring this like so after you've done so, and we continue down that path, then he'll find himself in trouble. However, this is not one of them times. It's fine to start like that. So next step, we'll develop our knight. Why? Well, because it develops a piece. But also on top of that, it attacks two of the center squares, including a pawn. White defends, black defends, both developing a piece, whilst defending his pawn and attacking the square here. Now this next move, I was taught it by a Spanish fella. I'm afraid I can't remember his name. Roy something, I think. I wish I did, because I use his opening a lot. Bishop to here, develops your piece, attacks the knight, and also frees the way for your king to castle. Now, as long as you've not moved a piece, you can do that with your king. Once, it's called castling. You can do that king side, like so. And there's a queen side castle, but I'll show you how to do that later. Anyway, here we stand. Now, no matter what happens, unless he moves his knight, it's vulnerable. Now sure, maybe your opponent says, "Ah, well, away with you, you foolish bishop." Then you can take the knight at the cost of your bishop. And the only way they can regain that minor piece is by taking you with a pawn. Let's try this one. Probably the best one. Now, your opponent has been started in a way that he's somewhat hobbled now. Because these two pawns, that's called doubling your pawns. This pawn is now worth half what this pawn's worth. And now the king can choose to... Now white can choose to go up. Perhaps to develop his bishop. Or he can move his knight out. Both knights out. Or he can castle. But either way, he's lost no time. He's still one piece ahead in the development, and he doesn't have double pawns. This is a fairly strong opening. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to show you what I meant before by following your opponent exactly. I go there, he goes there. I go there, he goes there. Right, now that's okay so far. But if I go there like that and take the pawn, and then he goes there and takes my pawn, well, he's followed me too closely now. Because I can attack his knight with the queen. And if he were to move his knight back, I can now move my knight here. Check. And the queen will be lost, no matter what happens. So don't follow your opponent too closely. Always do whatever you can to disadvantage him. You might also see your opponent do that. Now that seems very strange, because it completely locks in his bishop, and it doesn't really do much to get in the center. And so under such circumstances you might find yourself capturing both. And the idea here is he's going to attack you in the middle again. And there are all sorts of combinations. But I can assure you of this. If your opponent isn't putting some sort of an attack as his first move on these squares, and if your opponent isn't developing pieces now, then you will surely win. See, we open, pushes, knight out, pushes, knight out, pushes. Your opponent's already lost here. He just doesn't have the time to ward off your attacks. And so a victory becomes almost impossible. Chess is about time, one movement at a time, constantly moving forward to your objective. And that is the king's pawn opening. Little bit of noise. Well, now you know everything. Well, except for everything, I guess. Knowing the alphabet doesn't mean you can write a poem now, does it? But it's late, and it's too dark, my young majesty. I don't want to ruin your eyes now. I think we should get some rest. A story? What kind of a story? I can tell you about that. Make yourself comfortable, and I'll try to remember how it goes. So there were these two fellers, like brothers they were. They were knights, and their names were Ethelred and Uhtred. Aye. And they went into battle one day together. And the war and the battle was lost. And both knights were captured. And they were put in a cell together. And one morning, Uhtred woke up. And he looked out of his window. And he saw a beautiful princess. Aye, she looked magnificent, so she did. Breathtaking. And Uhtred, he woke up, Ethelred, and he said, "Come look out of the window." And Ethelred saw her, and he fell in love. But Uhtred felt he'd seen her first. He wasn't really in love with her, but he had the claim on her. Now, Uhtred's parents weren't as wealthy as Ethelred's, so Uhtred couldn't really make up the ransom as quick, and Ethelred was released. Ethelred was banished by the king, and the king said, if you ever come back, I'll have your head. But Ethelred was so in love with the princess, he came back anyway. And he saw her in the courtyard. And he started to run towards her to profess his undying love. And yet, at the very same time, Uhtred broke out of his cell and was also running towards the princess to say the same thing. Then Uhtred and Ethelred started to fight right there in the courtyard, even though all the gods were around and nobody could see them. And they were caught again, and this time the king said, off with their heads for both of them. But the queen wouldn't allow that. She said, no, look how brave these two are, that they would fight and risk their lives for our daughter. So I think what we should do is we should hold a tournament, and the winner of that tournament gets our daughter's hand in marriage. And obviously both of them accepted now. So it was a strange tournament. They had 20 men each, and they fought until one of them was injured, and then they were taken off the field. So there were no casualties as such. And it came down to the last two fellers. Uhtred stood at one side, Uther at the other. And Uhtred said a prayer to the god Mars, for he wasn't truly in love with the princess. It was more about victory for him, and that's exactly what he asked Mars for. Victory. And Ethelred, he prayed to Venus. He prayed that he would marry the woman he loved. The princess also made a prayer. She prayed that she would marry no one, or someone that actually loved her. And so the two knights came charging towards each other, faster and faster and faster. And then bang, they collided. And Ethelred was knocked to the ground, injured. And he started to be dragged off the battlefield, Uhtred being the winner. But as he was walking up to the princess, his horse stepped on a spear and bucked him off. And Ethelred, Uther, landed on his back, mortally wounded. And Ethelred came running to his brother, and he said, I wish I'd spent more time with you, and I wish we hadn't fought, and I'm so sad that you'll be moving on to the next world. And Uther said, I want you to marry the princess, because I know you love her. And the king heard this, and so did the princess. And she got married, and they lived very well thereafter. And the interesting thing, you see, was all three prayers were answered, for the princess married someone she loved. Ethelred married the princess who he loved, and Uhtred, he got the victory that he wanted, and ultimately reconciled with his friend. And that's your story. Now get some rest. Sure, I don't know any songs. And anyway, I'm a terrible singer. You don't want to hear me sing. I've told you I don't know any songs. Well, if it shut you up. I don't know one. The old, reminds me of the old lands. I played the wild rose. I see, I told you I was terrible. I don't know why. I played the wild rover for many years, and I spent all me money on whiskey and beer. But now I've returned with gold in great store. Sure, I never will play the wild rover no more. And it's no say never. No say never no more. Sure, I'll play the wild rover. No, never no more. I went down to an alehouse I used to frequent, and I told the landlady me money was spent. I asked her for credit. She answered me nay. Such custom as yours I could have any day, and it's no say never. No say never no more. Sure, I'll play the wild rover. No, never no more. I pulled out me pocket 10 sovereigns bright, and the landlady's eyes, they grew wild with delight. She said, I have whiskey and wines of the best, and the words I said previous were only in jest, and it's no say never. No say never no more. Sure, I'll play the wild rover. No, never no more. I'll go back to me family, confess what I've done, and I'll ask them to pardon their prodigal son. And when they embrace me, as often have before, sure, I never will play that wild rover no more. And it's no say never. No say never no more. Sure, I'll play the wild rover. No, never